Welcome to the Integral Stage, and to a special belated episode of the Future Faces of Spirit series, this one featuring a conversation between Professor Allan Combs and Layman Pascal. We originally recorded this at the beginning of 2020, right after the pandemic shutdowns began, but we didn't end up releasing it because while the conversation is interesting and wide-ranging, it didn't stick very closely to the topic of the future of religion, so we considered holding on to it and releasing it as part of another series. However, after some time and consideration, I've decided it does touch on enough topics of relevance to religion and spirituality in our age that I would go ahead and release it as part of this series. Allan Combs doesn't really need much of an introduction in our community. He's the author of The Radiance of Being and Consciousness Explained Better, and of course is the Combs in the Wilber-Combs lattice. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Without further ado, I turn the stage over to Layman and Professor Combs.
You know, with this series is about the future of religion, which I know is not necessarily your specialty, but at the same time.
Yeah, but I've been reading the book.
There you go.
And I got another book I want to talk about a little bit too, Ervin László's most recent.
Yeah, Bruce mentioned that. Let's just jump in right there. What is it that struck you about Laszlo's books that you wanted to bring up?
Well, Laszlo, first I'll say, is an old friend. We've worked together, written together. He is recognized as one of the leading thinkers in the world, although he's not that well known in the U.S. Actually, may have published as many books as Ken, I'm not sure. I joke about the fact that over the weekend he'll write another book. But Ervin László, for the last few decades, has become increasingly interested in the spiritual life of the world. I could talk about his history a lot. He's a very prominent person. He's the kind of guy that has lunch with world leaders, or he used to. He's actually 10 years older than me now and living in Italy. I hope he's not going out much. But his background, he knows a lot of physics. He's a smart guy. He spent the first half of his life as a concert pianist, traveled all over the world, and then he got interested in systems theory. He wrote his first book on systems theory in the late 70s. I think it was titled The World as a Systems Theorist Sees It. And it was the first book on systems theory, really. So we could talk about that a lot. But he's also been very interested in what used to be called the world problematique, the political reality of the world, and he's become more and more interested in understanding consciousness and the deep structure of consciousness as it relates to the cosmos. So he's written a number of books now on topics that you might consider sort of woo-woo. But the man knows what he's talking about. I mean, he could be wrong, but he's written a book on the Akashic Field, for example. He views the cosmos as a holographic or holotropic process. And he actually understands the physics of that, as near as I can tell. So he is kind of a little different than most of the spiritual folks because it all spins out of his holographic view of the cosmos. He was a good friend of Karl Pribram's, for example, and David Bohm. So he knows the folks, he's been the distance. But he's interested in life and life after death as well, really. I was at a conference in Italy a couple of years ago when all the big people and out-of-the-body experiences were there. But he sees all of this as a kind of a holonomic process, and he sees the whole cosmos as tending towards coherence. And it means on a lot of different levels. So one of his books very recently, let me make sure I have the title right. It's called Intelligence of the Universe, or Intelligence of the Cosmos, in which he makes a strikingly effective argument that the whole cosmos is kind of almost an organic process, that, there are like hundreds of variables that have to be just right for life to occur, and they're all just right. And so he sees the universe as a kind of almost like an organism. that there's this underlying, undergirding drive towards complexity, towards growth, towards wholeness, towards coherence. So that's where he comes from. And it crosses the border between human consciousness and human experience and the physical world as we see it around us in cosmology. So in that book, which is a short little book, it's only about 40 pages of his writing and then a number of other contributors, he makes a really amazing case. I think it's one of the most important books I've ever read, that the cosmos has a kind of life of its own, or a kind of organic quality, I should say, that tends towards complexity and evolution. And, it's the sort of thing T.R. de Chardin would have been delighted to read. It just fits with his way of seeing the cosmos. And there's a more recent book, and it's also short, called, let me get it right, Connecting to the Source. And this one's not quite as tightly reasoned, but it's beautifully written. And basically argues that inspirational experiences, like in nature or in religion or in music or in art or in love, all bring us more into a kind of coherence with the world around us, with others, a kind of resonance that is not just poetic, but connects us to the larger cosmos. So we have had, since the first humans, I guess, inspirational experiences, heightened experiences, and we always kind of brush those over to the side of the table. They're really nice, but they don't help us much understanding the world in a realistic way. And what Ervin's arguing is, no, that's not right. When we have these spiritual, heightened, coherent experiences of the world around us, of other people, and so on, we're actually coming into synchrony or coming into resonance or coherence with the living cosmos that we inhabit. So I don't know that this one is closely reasoned so much as the other book, but they fit together, make a nice pair. Actually, I'm working on a book review with one of my graduate students to bring both of them together and publish them. So I guess that's all I wanted to say about Ervin, but I'm always a little disappointed that he's not better known in the U.S. because he's a guy that's his history is really amazing. He's taught at universities all over the world, Sorbonne, Princeton, it goes on and on and on. He's won all kinds of awards. And he's an amazing guy.
So you think that in addition to being an amazing guy, that his work is a good example of plausible scientific models that regenerate a lot of the things that have traditionally been asserted by religion?
Well, that's exactly right. You said it very well. And yes, I do think that about him. I think he's one of the world's leading thinkers. And everything he's coming up with really meshes very well with the more generic or higher principles of spirituality, no matter where you find them. He himself is not a religious person in any strict sense, but yeah. You said it. You framed it very well.
There's an interesting question in there about these, peak experiences and flow states, states of amplified coherence.
Yes.
And whether they're all roughly of the same kind, or whether they might be moving in different directions from each other. Are they all? Do we have regular consciousness and then this more coherent aligned consciousness? Or do we have regular consciousness and a set of options of very different kinds, some of which might be useful and some of which might be degenerative or irrational?
Right. Well, you bring up a really excellent question, Layman, and one that we could talk about from now on. As a matter of fact, I am personally, I'll just preface this a little bit. I am personally a believer in the perennial philosophy. going back to Aldous Huxley in his book, The Perennial Philosophy, written in the late 40s, in which he argues that all the great traditions have a kind of common core of deep mystical experience. So I kind of buy that. I'm not going to buy it completely. But one of the topics we want to talk about is Ken Wilber, so I'll touch on him here. He is one of the major proponents of the perennial philosophy nowadays, although there have been many. Houston Smith, I think, was one of the greatest writers and most readable writers about the perennial philosophy, a wonderful writer. You know, his first book as a young man, I don't remember the title, it's called The Religions of the World or something, sold more copies than any other book in the Bible. A highly readable guy, and he was one of the first Americans back in the 50s to go to Japan and be trained, he and his wife, in a Zen context, monastery, I guess. So I'm a big believer in the idea that all these traditions, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, Christian mysticism, and so on, all seem to have a kind of common root experience, a kind of common reality. Now, exactly what that is, I don't know. A lot of people, including Ken Wilber now, are really promoting the idea of non-dual consciousness. So we could talk about that. But whatever it is, I have some belief in it. However, I don't believe it's the whole picture. And not that I think there are other kinds of experience that are superior. I don't really know. But there's more and more, at least at my school, California Institute of Integral Studies, exploring indigenous cultures, the spirituality of indigenous cultures. Of course, I live in South America. We have many, many indigenous cultures here that are still intact, and they have their own spiritual rituals, and many of them have potions, drugs, or whatever you want to call them. So there's a wealth of spiritual, or at least alternative experiences. And I hate to say they all boil down to the same experience Meister Eckhart had in the 15th century in Germany as a great mystic. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but I kind of don't think so. Now, if you follow the perennial philosophy, and we were going to talk about Ken Wilber, or any of the people that really follow the perennial philosophy, including myself, there's a kind of an ascendance, there's a kind of levels, that most of our theoretical work started with Piaget, developmental psychology. Ken, I see, is now actually identifying himself as a developmental psychologist, which is, I think, is correct. So I don't know. I think there are many kinds of experience, and whether, it's really hard, or maybe even meaningless, to rate these as higher or lower, especially when you get out of the Western theater, or you get out of the really big traditions. Actually, you can get into Taoism, and you can find a lot there that maps very nicely onto Vedanta, and you can find in Vedanta a lot of material that maps very well onto, for example, the perennial philosophy, as Aldous Huxley developed it, and Ken Wilber writes about it. So did Houston Smith, and so have I. But that's all. Those are the great religions, as Wilber calls them. But there are all these others, especially living in South America now. I'm very aware of them. They're all around. And the indigenous people in the part of the world I live in are a major part of the population, and they have coherent societies. They haven't really gone through what American, U.S. natives have, at least not since the Spaniards came. So that's a different story, but it's kind of all been absorbed into Catholicism here. So nobody's fighting over religion. We have parades and celebrations about every 2 or 3 days, and everybody just celebrates. So I don't know. I would not want to say personally that I think the perennial philosophy, as Ken Wilber writes it, or even as Houston Smith, who I think very highly of, or my own writing, summarizes the whole picture. What I see going on in some of my colleagues, especially at CIS, is kind of that I don't agree with either, is that they just want to dump the whole thing. Well, it's Eurocentric, male-dominated. I don't know what to say. They just want to dump it. I mean, even the Dalai Lama, I've seen people just say, well, what's he know? He just, he follows this one path. I think that's a big mistake. I think the great traditions, the great mystical traditions are just that. And they have all the virtues, at least in some ways, that they're said to have. But I would not want to take those and say, well, if we ever, well, I'll tell you that I've been watching these YouTubes by Wade Davis. Wade Davis is worth remembering. He's written some wonderful books about different cultures around the world that he gets very involved with. In one of my classes, we're reading a book called The Wayfinders, about folks in the Southern Pacific who will go out for thousands of miles without a compass. And they can read where they're at, where land is, find their way around from the ocean, in the ocean currents and the deep waves. I mean, it's amazing. And they just live in a different world. In fact, there's a neat little movie I'm trying to get my students to watch called The Whale Rider, from New Zealand, and there's a lot of native culture in that. So you can find some wonderful YouTubes with Wade Davis. There's one that's only about an hour long where he did for the National Geographic Society, where he talks about, he said, these cultures, and he's lived in South America, and he's lived in a lot of different cultures. He said, they're not just failing to be Western. They're not just struggling to be us. It's a big mistake to think that these cultures, given enough time and resources, will get like us. Because he says they won't. They have their own values and they have their own experience. Although it also, I think, would be a really deep mistake to say they don't have deep spiritual experiences. I mean, some of these people are incredibly psychic. They have visions. They understand the earth in some ways better than anybody else, other than maybe MIT ecologists. And so I'm going to hold on to them, but I'm not going to dump the perennial philosophy.
Yeah, it seems like nobody can be sure to what degree the existing cultures in the world represent actual stages of development.
Yeah, it's not even clear that
stages, even if we're not a good example of them, or if there might be a greater range of variation in how those stages could develop.
Perfectly true. And I think part of what Wade Davis is saying is they're not really interested in developing the way we do.
Yeah. Now, there's speaking in terms of the perennial philosophy, there's a couple different ways to go at it. I think a lot of people use a very simple model where there's the ordinary, conventional egoic consciousness and the transcendental option. But then other people, and a little bit like you did with the Combs-Wilber lattice, make a more differentiated model in which there's several different kinds of consciousness contrasted against possible developmental states. So where's your thinking now about different states of consciousness in terms of what they are and what they aren't, and whether it's relevant to divide up different types or not?
Yeah. Well, I haven't really changed my mind much. The idea of the Wilber-Combs matrix, I actually had it published first. But Ken said, well, I already had that in my book. And he said, well, where is it? He said, well, I didn't see it in your book, Ken. He said, well, it's on page 437 in the footnote. And then, well, Jesus. So I'm just glad he includes my name at all with it, because the way Ken works is that he doesn't look down on anyone, as near as I can tell. But when he learns something, it's his knowledge. And so he often doesn't give people credit for where he got the information. So he's always kept me along the Wilber-Combs lattice, even though maybe it should have been the Combs-Wilber lattice. But I think it's very valid. I haven't really changed my view of it at all. My original construction of the lattice or the matrix was based on systems theory because, as I said, I've been a colleague of Ervin László's and systems theorist in psychology from way back. And my idea is, and if you read any of my books, especially The Radiance of Being, which is my most serious book, somebody said I should give away an Alka-Seltzer with it to help read it. And then there's another book that covers this material in a much easier form, Consciousness Explained Better. But, you know, I got that title from Dan Dennett. He said Consciousness Explained. And then I discovered that if you want to sell a book, you want it to come up in Amazon somewhere where people will sit. And so they'll look at his book, and then right underneath it, there'll be a book that's explained better.
You're piggybacking off his title.
Yeah, I did. It's really funny. But anyway, where was I with this? So the idea was, I really got my thinking really comes from Charlie Tart. I got to give him credit. He was, for years and years, the only parapsychologist, psychologist for consciousness at Berkeley, and he's still alive and well. He runs a listserv, and occasionally he and I run across each other in cyberspace. But he wrote a book called, I believe it was called States of Consciousness. I'd have to double check, but this was way back in the 70s, I think. And it's a systems theory approach. Now, in those days, systems theory was made out of boxes and arrows. So you got this and you draw an arrow to that and so on. And nowadays, systems theory, the way I developed it, is through dynamical systems in which processes flow into each other. So, but it's still the same basic idea. And his idea was, and I think it's a very sound one, is that we do have different states of consciousness. I even wrote a book called Being Stoned about marijuana intoxication. There's hypnosis, there are various trance states, meditative states, non-dream sleep, dream sleep. We're going to make a huge list. And each one of these states of consciousness has its own properties. And so those come together and form a whole. So that's where the system is. For example, marijuana intoxication. You know, there's so many different kinds of marijuana nowadays, and I don't smoke it anymore. But in the old days, you got stoned, and then you got hungry, and we got what we call the munchies, and we would eat and eat and eat, and we would listen to slow jazz on the radio, and you would lay around because you couldn't move much anyway after you got stoned, and your short-term memory your memory would go to hell. We would smoke until we couldn't finish the sentence, okay, because we couldn't remember what we were talking about. Now, long-term memory didn't affect it much. So here's some of the pieces. Long-term memory stayed in place when you're intoxicated with marijuana in this way. But short-term memory goes to hell, and if you smoke enough, you can't complete a sentence. So, but everything gets funny. So you're laughing and laughing, can't complete a sentence. Food tastes wonderful. Music is wonderful to become absorbed in if it's like slow jazz or some rock and roll, but you don't listen to Stravinsky or stuff like that. So these are all pieces of it. There's a particular kind of humor. There's the body sense that the body's heavy and relaxed. I mean, this is completely different than LSD. LSD heightens the visual sense. People paint, they do art, they talk. They don't really get hungry, although they might eat some, but it's just a different energy. And mescaline, I only had mescaline once. People told me it was really physical. I didn't know what they meant till I took it, and then I was horny as could be for like 6 or 8 hours. So these are all pieces of a state of consciousness. And the point is, from systems theory, that they make a coherent whole. So you can get stoned on marijuana in this way, and you can stay stoned for several hours. It's a coherent state until it wears off. And deep sleep is a coherent state. In fact, one of the points I make in, I think, the Radiance of Being is that if you're driving a car and you start to go to sleep, once you start getting pulled into that state, which in systems theory would call an attractor, you can get pulled right down into it. And that's why it's so dangerous to drive and when you're sleepy. But once you get in that state, if you're tired, you'll stay in it. I mean, ordinarily, when you're sleeping at home, it's a resilient state. In fact, dreaming is so resilient that you'll work, people will work door alarms and telephones and everything else into the dream. In fact, it's not that rare for somebody to wet the bed because they just don't want to get out of the dream. So that's a view of consciousness that I hold, that there are many, many states, many different kinds of drug states and so on. Some of them are good for one thing, some for another. In fact, there have even been articles on state-specific knowledge. So you may get stoned and you may have a great insight and you can communicate it to somebody else that's stoned, but somebody that's not stoned thinks it's just nonsense. It's really funny. Anyway, I could talk more about that. But my point then is this idea I applied to the traditional spiritual states. Now, Ken has no interest in those. The rumor is that he had a terrible LSD experience or something when he was a young man and he's never done it since. I don't know. Maybe that's wrong. But he never talks about it and he doesn't use any kind of drugs that I know of. So my idea is that the traditional states, like in Vedanta, that the Wilber-Combs matrix is built around, are states of consciousness, and they have these properties. And once you achieve one of these states, say in deep meditation, samadhi, for example, my own tradition that I practice is pretty much standard Raja Yoga. And my teachers never talked about non-dual consciousness, although I don't know, maybe he had it, but he always talked about samadhi. Samadhi is a state you come to through a lot of meditation. And I get in samadhi once in a while. It's a very comfortable state. It's a state of absolute quiescence, deep relaxation. And if you're really an advanced meditator like he is, somebody can fire a pistol near you and you won't even hear it. That's not my case. But so I basically took these ideas and I applied them to the traditional states, or they're actually not only called states in Vedanta, they're sheaths, bodies, and they are the lateral axis of the Wilber-Combs matrix. The other thing Ken and I both pretty much agreed on, and this was the real insight really, is that you would interpret these states of your own experience based on your level of intellectual development. So that's the vertical side. And that started out as basically Piaget, but Ken pushes it further, which is okay with me. But let's take an example. I'm trying to remember the name of the man who, I should tell you that I'm dyslexic as can be. And I can't remember names. I won't even go into that, but it's actually a recognized neurological condition that I have. But the astronaut who came back to Earth inspired to start the Noetics Institute.
Edgar Mitchell.
Edgar Mitchell. He's actually been on one or two of my doctoral committees. Wonderful man, very intelligent, very interested in the larger cosmos. Well, you know, virtually all the astronauts had powerful experiences. You know, it just blew them away to see the blue Earth beneath them and so on. But, you know, they came back and they interpreted this all different ways. One of them became a fundamentalist. I don't remember which one. Edgar Mitchell, I think, was one of the most intelligent and advanced, mentally advanced astronauts that ever went up into space. And this opened up a kind of divine, or I should say, sacred cosmos for him. And he started the Noetics Institute, thank you, as a place to do research and to broaden our knowledge of the cosmos and to do research into areas that traditional science was not exploring yet. I think they are exploring most of them now, but I remember when the institute was early on, I asked the director, I remember his name, I said, what do you do? And he said, well, we do the edges of science. For example, we have a project looking at the healing system of the body, which traditional science was not looking at that time. So Edgar Mitchell came back. He had this powerful experience. It was one of the, you can relate it to one of the Vedantic states. I don't know which one. I had to stop and look. But it was a mystical state. And he interpreted it through his understanding of the cosmos as an open, sacred cosmos that was worth exploring scientifically. Whereas other astronauts came back and they wanted to get near God, and some of them actually became very traditional. So the point being that if you go intellectually and you grow, what Ken Wilber calls growing up, then your interpretation of broader experiences will change according to where you're at with it. Actually, at the time we started to talk about this, Ken was sort of in a box too. He'd gotten himself in the corner, I think, because he really was emphasizing, and I was too at the time, the developmental stages, what he now calls growing up. And we had actually constructed things so that as you grow up through these intellectual periods that start out as very Piagetian and then go on to higher levels, that the Vedantic stages, the higher levels of consciousness, would grow right on up out of that, continuing vertical move. Now, one of the implications of that was that no young child could ever have a true spiritual experience. And Ken even joked about that. Might as well talk about worms, he said at one point. No, Ken's got a sarcastic side and funny. But once and people didn't like it, you can imagine. And one of the outcomes of looking at things through this matrix of understanding that you could interpret spiritual experiences, subtle, causal, non-dual, whatever they are, that you could interpret them through the mind you have developmentally, allowed him, this is where he got out of the box, he said, well, now we understand that young children can have truly deep spiritual experiences. They just interpret them the way a child would. So, yeah, one of my favorite movies, I teach a course on movies, is the old Ingmar Bergman movie, The Seventh Seal, in which a knight is coming back from the Crusades in a very existentially bleak mood. And he gets connected to some traveling group of actors, performers in medieval Europe. And they're very simple people. And they see visions, especially the mother sees visions of of Mary, the mother, walking with the child in the woods, and these wonderful visions. Whereas the knight, played by, I'm trying to remember who the knight is. You probably know he's played in so many of Bergman's movies. He just died recently. But he sees nothing. He even climbs up to where the witch is going to be burned and looks in her eyes. He said, I don't see anything. He says, here, take this. It'll take the pain away. It's a wonderful movie, and I love the contrast between the existential knight who can't find the meaning of life and these very simple people who are having visions. And the world is simple and wonderful for them in some ways. It's a wonderful movie, actually. So I won't go on about it because I love to talk about movies. But yes.
It's a very liberating move, I think, to get away from that system where you just put the spiritual states on top of the normal developmental stages, and instead you make that 90-degree turn. You add that lateral dimension. Now,
Makes all the difference.
I think there's a question there about about how lateral that lateral dimension is, which is, do we think of those as equally present, equally important states that coexist, or do we think of them sort of hierarchically? Because the old cultures tended to think of gross consciousness as lower, and that you would ascend through these. And some people still feel like that's the case because experientially it is, but we could also critique that as being too hierarchical, too patriarchal, too much of a rejection of the manifest and an obsession with the abstract, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I think you're perfectly right to question this. I think the sheets from Vedanta, as I understand it, could be wrong, but these grow straight out of meditation experiences. If you do traditional meditation like I do, you move through these states in a kind of progression as your meditation becomes deeper. And if you read the Yoga Sutras, for example, the book, the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali, you get, and it's an older book, I mean, you get this kind of progression. It's a progression of experiences. Now, you have to really reinterpret those a little bit, but basically, you experience these sheaths or states of consciousness as you move forward through deeper and deeper states of meditation or quietude. Gee, but now, and if you read Ken Wilber's more recent work, and a lot of people, I think a lot of Buddhists especially, in some sense, you might say, well, they're all present all the time. I don't know, but I think there is a lot of truth to the idea that there are other paths to, and I hate to even say higher, I would say broader realms of consciousness. I have a friend named Peter Fenner. You may have heard of him. He comes to the Bay Area now and then. Peter Fenner has written several books, and he's a Buddhist teacher. He's an Australian. He's in Australia right now. And you can even get his counseling. You can call him on the phone, and for a reasonable price, he'll talk to you. He's a highly trained, long-term, very real Buddhist practitioner who's all about non-dual consciousness. And now, my teacher, Swami Rama, was not about non-dual consciousness. I never heard him say a word about it. He was all about samadhi and reaching samadhi. And but I had lunch. I've seen Peter Fenner a number of times, and I gave him a good endorsement for one of his books, and we've become friends. But we had lunch together in not Santa Rosa. What's this town right down just north of the bridge? Tell me. One of you that
I don't know California.
Oh, well. You don't know California if you drive down 101. Yeah. No, it doesn't matter. We had lunch out on the sidewalk together one day, and I had a non-dual experience, the only one I've ever had in my life. I mean, this man radiates it, and he has a kind of quietness about him, and a quietude, and a kind of ease of being that you can feel. Oh, this is a guy who spent at least one, maybe several years in India in a Buddhist monastery, and then wrote a book nobody can read, and then kind of came out. And he is in a non-dual state. You get near him, it's contagious. He went from talking to me to a radio interview. And the announcer, sort of doing what you're doing here, in the middle of the interview, he said, I can't think of a thing to say. And Peter just laughed. He said, that's not the first time that's happened with me.
What do you think the mechanism of that contagion is? How does a state get transferred from one to another?
I don't know, but I don't think it's hierarchical. I think it's something really fundamental that he tapped. And if you read his book, Peter Fenner, has one or two books, and in the tapes, he talks about how people work and work and work to achieve higher levels of consciousness, and yet why do it? It's all right there if you can adopt the right frame of mind. You're not going anywhere. It's just right there. And that's why he's such a good counselor, by the way. He can talk to you and you can be neurotic and somehow he will deconstruct all your worries and they kind of float away. I don't know what it is. But yeah, that's a different kind of spirituality. And in some ways, it seems to me much closer to what Ken Wilber and others talk about as this higher non-dual state, except he doesn't go through any of those stages. He just sort of has got it, and people that work with him catch it from him somehow.
No.
Well, there's another guy in I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, there's another guy in California here who's really about non-dual. I don't remember his name. He used to be a bicycle repairman, and then he started writing about non-dual experience. And if you read any of his books, you just get high. I was in Findhorn Community in Scotland. And somebody started reading this book, and it was this essay, and it really got me into almost a non-dual state. And I said, "Where did you get that book?" He said, "Oh, that's by so-and-so. Who lives right down the coast from me, used to." I could dig his name out. But there are more and more people around now that are teaching non-dual stuff. And at least some of them, I think, are probably very legitimate. This guy is, certainly.
Now, I read an article you were involved in on the fractal topology of transcendence.
Yeah, that's one of my students actually wrote that. That was her dissertation.
There's some ideas in there.
Oh, and what's his name that we were talking about that founded IONS?
Right, yeah.
He was on the committee.
Nice.
Yeah.
Here's what I wanted to ask you about, because part of the general concept was to use thermodynamics ideas like bifurcation and far from equilibrium systems in order to talk about the transformation of consciousness into transcendental conditions.
Yeah.
It seemed to me that there's a kind of contradiction between the idea of the perturbation of consciousness that we would expect in a far from equilibrium condition, and the kind of tranquility and sattva and harmony and nearby ordinariness that a lot of the wisdom traditions say characterizes the transcendental state. So, where do you lean on that? Does it require perturbation, or what does far from equilibrium mean, or is that even a good metaphor for the shift?
Well, I think you make some excellent points. And that was her dissertation. And in the article, she was a lead author. So I'm kind of making an apologia here in a way. I think she did brilliant work. And I think she used these concepts in a very creative way. But I don't personally have an investment in wanting to talk about energy and about how literal these kind of ideas can be taken. I take them more in a metaphorical way, but I don't know. It was nice work. But I will say this, that some of the highest energy states in a complex system, like the human brain, are also among the most quiescent experientially. For example, there are some states of meditation that are very, very quiet, but the brain is very busy. So I'd have to go back and look at examples, but I can remember thinking about this and reading about this. There are some human states of consciousness and biological states that are relatively high energy, but yet quiescent. It's paradoxical. So I'll say that much, but I don't have a strong opinion. I think she created, quite frankly, a brilliant little piece sort of out of the air using abstract ideas. And I'm not here to tell you that they have literal cash, you can cash them in literally or not. I'm certainly not going to criticize her. I was very impressed with her work.
No, it's certainly a provocative set of ideas.
Yeah, let's leave it like that.
Now, here's something I would want to ask you, which is, when you think about these states, attractor conditions of consciousness, Do you think how ontological and how epistemological do you think they are? Do you think they're basically different configurations of human neurochemistry, or do you think of them as conditions of reality to which the brain may have evolved and adapted over the course
Yeah, well, that's a perfectly good question, and I certainly can't answer it. Yeah, I don't know. It harkens to the basic question of how the mind and consciousness and the brain are related. And it's all full of puzzles because we know, for example, that the brain, the different conditions of the brain create different kinds of experiences. And to some extent, it works the other way too, that if you're joyous and you're in a good mood, then the whole chemistry of your brain and body shift from when you're depressed and so on. And we know that problems with the brain can really limit conscious experience severely. Brain damage is a very bad business, or brains that just don't work right. I teach a whole course on the brain and consciousness. So first book we read is about 20 years old, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. But Sacks made a whole career writing about people with different kinds of experiences because they had different kinds of brains. On the other hand, I went to this conference at Ervin László's Center in Italy a couple of years ago, and it was full of people who have studied near-death experiences, out-of-the-body experiences. Now, what's going on there? For example, one of the speakers was this fellow physician, surgeon a few years ago, who had a long extended coma experience. Now, the brain was essentially shut down during that. I don't want to say it was brain dead, but there was nothing going on there you could see with EEG or anything else. And then he came back and had all this wonderful experience of going to another realm. Spent a week in heaven, as it were. Now, I heard him talk, and I'm a bit of a cynic when physicians start telling me stuff. And then, oh, God, here it is. He's going to tell me all about it. But I'm trying to remember his name. He has an unusual name, and he has a book called, what is his book? I have to think about it for a minute. And I can find it if you want me to. But I was blown away. He's very bright. He's a very bright guy. And he had done his homework. He knew the whole history of out-of-the-body, near-death experiences. I can't say anything more positive about him. Ibn Alexander. Somebody posted that. Bruce. Ibn, E-B-E-N, Alexander. He's written one or two other books since then, but I have to say, I'm very impressed with him. And of course, he's not the only one. There are a lot of people writing about this. So what do you make of that? And what's going on? It seems like this is one of the things that Ervin László is very interested in. He's a great believer in what he calls the Akashic realm, that there's a subtle realm, and it's not mystical. He sees it as a kind of quantum field, which stores knowledge and can support consciousness. And as crazy as that sounds, he's got plenty of math to go with it. Whether it's correct math or not, I don't know. I was talking to him in a taxi cab about this once. He said, how do you know all that math? And he was offended. He said, oh, you just take Schrödinger's equation and run it on out. But another person that was at this same conference was Stuart Kaufman. No, not Stuart Kaufman. He's the systems here. Stuart, what's going to come to me in a second. But he's the guy who has done all the work on the quantum brain. Stuart Hameroff. He is an anesthesiologist. He knows an amazing amount about the brain. He's the real deal. I've heard him debate with Daniel Dennett. He's always right up front. I just really enjoy him. Known him for years. And he thinks that it might be possible that consciousness can continue outside of the body and outside of the brain through this subquantum field that he, and he works with this, with the mathematician. Who's the guy? I told him bad with names. But the mathematician Penrose, we're talking about a Nobel laureate mathematician here. He knows what he's talking about. Whether he's right or not, I don't know. But here they are talking about consciousness outside the brain surviving somehow. So I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think we've got a lot more to learn about what the human potential is.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing here for me, because religion sort of has two parts, and one is that it proposes and safeguards a set of ideas and insights into reality, and we seem to be able to at least plausibly regenerate a lot of those through a scientific modality.
Right.
The other part of religion is to instruct people in their lives and to mobilize people collectively and to try to make the world a more valuable place. So,
yes.
What do you think about that? From the point of view of science and spirituality, are there implications for how we should live, for how we should organize our social systems, for the kind of politics we need to have? Right? Is there a moral downstream implication from all this stuff?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't think about religion much. As I told people ask me, did you come from a religious family? I say, oh, no, we were Presbyterians. Which in plain English meant the church was a social event once a week. I used to love to go to the Catholic masses when they were in Latin, but when they started doing them in English, they lost their magic for me. Although I'm living in a Catholic country right now, and I see it's a whole different worldview, really, and I won't go into it, but I honor it, and it has its virtues. But I'm one of those 80% that is a spiritual person, but not a religious person. And, I've been reading Ken's book on the future religion. I have to say that man leaves me in the dust when he starts talking about some of the more abstract, supposedly advanced ideas in Buddhism. I'm just not there with him. And not that I'm criticizing him. I don't know enough to criticize when he starts talking about Dzogchen and stuff. Now, I had a dear friend who was probably the world's leading Dzogchen scholar, Herbert Gunther, years ago, who actually helped me write The Radiance of Being. But he was a very practical guy, and he saw a lot of this stuff, a lot of these ideas in terms of dynamical system theory, as a matter of fact. But I don't really understand what Ken is arguing for at the highest levels. I'm not going to say it's wrong. What do I know? But it doesn't inspire me. It's just too abstract. Now, Ken is one of the brightest people on the planet. I have no problem with that. But I consider him very Apollonian. There's just this brilliant light of the intellect, and it's a straight line from here to the highest levels. And he will argue, we argued about that. There's another side of me that's a Jungian. And Jungians have to say, if you really want wisdom, you got to go down. You got to get down. And so I don't know what to say. I don't have a lot of positive feelings about religions in general, although I am deeply moved by mystical traditions. I've read a lot of Meister Eckhart, von Bingham, and what's her name? Hildegard von Bingham. I actually had a dissertation. A student came to me from Berkeley, from the School of Theology, who did a dissertation comparing Rhineland mysticism with people like Hildegard von Bingham and Meister Eckhart with Dzogchen Buddhist ideas. And it was very readable, but I don't find Ken's explorations of these readable because he's either too smart or too abstract, or I didn't learn them early enough in my life, or I don't know what. So I don't really have a lot to say. I don't look to religions for
it's
the future
tough
of humankind.
it's tough to have conversations about religion because it's not always clear what the word means. You know, we
Right.
often think in terms of a handful of famous religions that may have predominated over the last 2,000 years.
And
But
that's kind of the way Ken talks about it.
yeah, and most of religion, whether it's religion of tomorrow or the religion of people who don't think of themselves as religious or the religion of prehistory, my
Right.
assumption is most of religion didn't think of itself as religious.
Well, that's an interesting idea. You know, almost none of art, well, nobody thought of art as art before the Renaissance. Somebody wrote a book about the great artists. Literally, I don't know his name. If you're in that book, you're one of the great artists of the Renaissance. And people started talking about art, but in the Middle Ages, craftsmen made stuff. And it wasn't viewed as art at all, particularly. So you make a very good point. Did they think of it as religion? Did the Greeks think of, especially the early Greeks, the Dionysians and so on, were they thinking of it as religion? I think they just drank a lot of wine and had a festival. And in the mystery schools they had too, which were very real. They say Socrates was the product of one of the ones run by women. But they weren't thinking of religion in the large sense. I think they were thinking of wisdom. So, yeah, it's a good question. One of the real questions is, to what extent does religion help the human race, and to what extent does it go the other way?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
religions all have this higher and lower dimension.
I think if we associate religion with a kind of stages of development model, you know, keeping that as flexible as we want to keep it, then every stage or every phase could have something religious of its own. But in that case,
Yes.
the religion of a previous phase would be regressive and would be problematic in society. And an up-to-date religion or a futuristic religion might be very useful.
Well, you know, there's this, I don't want to drift off because you make a very good point. But the icons of one major stage of history become the demons of the next. Snakes were all about healing in the ancient world, for example, and then they become associated with the devil in Christianity. And there are many, many examples like this. But I don't know what to say. I think, sure, the right religions. You know, and there's a very positive side. I live in this Latin country now, and I thought I would really resent all the Catholicism. And what I find is people are friendly, they support each other, they share festivals. I've been invited to several of them myself, wonderful dinners with extended families. Actually, we've been adopted by a local family here in Ecuador. Gee, it's great. And we're not, nobody's running an inquisition around here. It's just a kind of social support, what Laszlo would call coherence.
What's your take on shamanism? Because I know a lot of people would argue that if there's a future for religion, then it's a kind of shamanistic future, that it has to be, you know, embodied and personal and involve altered states and involve an attentiveness and appreciation of ecology and things like that, that maybe archaic religion is something that we have to come back to, you know, in a more scientific way.
Yeah. Well, it's a nice idea. I don't have any particular thoughts about it. It's a little unrealistic, but not a good idea. I mean, I can imagine if after the COVID and everything, if the world falls apart, that religions and social connections will reassemble in a more archaic way. It's not certainly something I would argue for or get invested in trying to produce, because I think the shamanic traditions have much to offer wisdom-wise, but they're very local, they're very different, each one from the other. We have a number of indigenous peoples that live very clear to me. One of them will shrink your head. They're head shrinkers. Well, I guess they're not allowed to do that anymore. And some of them fight with other ones. I mean, it's like reading about America U.S. When Columbus came over here. These different groups have integrity in themselves. Most of them are very friendly to people that go down to the Amazon. My wife was going to go down recently, except for the virus. Here's my little bird made by Amazonian natives, a sacred bird. Let me see. There it is.
Oh,
Uh,
very nice.
yeah, it's a paperweight for me. But yeah, but I mean, there's just a wealth of different worldviews, and they're not all so progressive. They're not all friendly. There's a dream culture. She was going to visit where they work on their dreams every morning. It sounds wonderful. But, 5 miles over through the rainforest, there's something else going on. So I don't know. I think that probably wisdom can come out of shamanism for sure. But, one problem with shamanism has certainly been commercialized. I have friends in the Bay Area who claim to be shamans, and they got that way through workshops. I went to a workshop. Now they're shamans, and and one of them, for example, is visiting ancient Lemurians at what is that mountain halfway up in northern California? Anyway, it gets very. Yeah, she goes up to Mount Shasta and these aliens come, or they still live there or something. Where was I going with that? Anyway, my dear friend Stanley Krippner, who probably knows as much about shamanism as anyone alive. He's quite old and not very healthy right now. Fortunately, we have a very nice interview with him on tape. But he's lived with shamans, a number of them in South America, Siberia. I mean, this man knows shamans. He was a good friend of Rolling Thunder. In fact, there's a book about Rolling Thunder that was written by one of Stan Krippner's friends and students. Okay, so where am I going with this? Stanley says, and he doesn't mince words about it, that unless you were trained in a tradition by people who are part of that tradition and you are recognized by that culture as a shaman, then you're not a shaman. It's not something anyone does as a solitary, I'm a shaman and I give workshops on the weekend, pay me. No, shamans are recognized by a culture. They are recognized to the point of having abilities and being part of the culture. Most of them don't live in East LA, for example. So I think shamanism has been cheapened a lot.
Yeah.
And commercialized a lot. Not that these friends of mine who claim to be shamans don't know anything. I don't want to say that. And I don't want to say their Reiki sessions are useless. But I will say that real shamans live in real communities of real Native people.
Yeah, there seem to be, at least two issues with the shamanism. The one is, whether or not you're authentically connected to the kinds of cultural matrices that shamanism comes out of. And on the other hand, what part of shamanism could be advanced and what's inherently primitive and tribal. Right. So we have to tease that apart.
Good question. Good question. We have, I don't know much about them, but I know we have clinics in the U.S. in the Southwest, the West, where Native healers share offices down the hall with traditional AMA doctors and work together. And I think that's a very healthy model. Because as Native healers point out, Western diseases often are outside of their realm. And on the other hand, spirit possession, maybe they can do something with, and certainly the AMA doctor didn't know anything about it. So that kind of cooperation, I would like to see more of it. It's not, health is not an area that I've taken much time with, but it just seems very optimistic to me that if people can work together in that way.
Yeah, that seems like an additional form of coherence, right? There's an internal coherence.
Yes,
And then
and
there's
I
us
hope
in the
those
cosmos,
kinds of
but
things.
there's these
Right.
different traditions and different ways of looking at things, and if they could be brought together, then we might have something.
I hope some of that sort of thing is going on in Canada. I understand that Canada has made big progress towards appreciating and connecting with the Native American people.
We're definitely doing better than we used to.
That's
We'll see
great.
how
I'm
far
so
it
glad
goes.
to hear it. Yeah.
What's your what's your wish for the world? Where would you like to see us go in the next couple of decades? What would you like to see people working on?
Well, I'm a Gebserian, Jean Gebser. I think enough time will work it out. My big concern is that we're going to destroy the planet before we get there. So while I'm not deeply involved with ecology, I feel guilty that I'm not. I actually got in touch with some of my friends who are like Dan Wall is one, W-A-H-L, Dan Wall. If you look at his website, he's doing wonderful work. I met him at Findhorn. Another person was one of my previous colleagues and students is David McConville. These people are doing really serious, deep work. David was, for years, chair of the board of the Buckminster Fuller Foundation. They're looking at things that really make a difference. And I wanted to get involved with that. I was going to teach a course, and as it turns out, I don't really know enough to do it. All I can do is support them. But my big worry is, I'm like Carl Sagan. Are we going to last long enough to get these problems solved? I think we will eventually. Jean Gebser thought it might take 200 or 300 years of fighting before we get things worked out and integral consciousness becomes a kind of mean. I don't know. That's my big worry. I think, and I'm worried that with the world going the way it is, that shortages and famines and so on will create a kind of conservative world environment. We already see it going on. That will make it very difficult to move forward for a while. So I don't know. I've never been an optimist. I have to understand that. I've always been a pessimist. I'm a great admirer of Schopenhauer, one of the famous pessimists. So I don't know. I just hope for the best, and that is all I can say.
Fair enough. This might be a good time to ask Bruce to come back in if Bruce has any questions he'd like to ask.
Yeah, because I'm going to have to go before long, but
yeah, sure. We're probably coming to the end now.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, and I hope.
Yeah, for me too.
Yeah, wonderful, and I'd love to come up and visit you.
Well, that'd be great. There's a place here for you.
Oh, well, now you should have said that. Well, I have a place in Ecuador for you.
All right, I'm looking forward
I have a
to
whole second floor to my flat. Yeah. Okay, Bruce, you got anything to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to just say I appreciate it and enjoyed your conversation, and I think it's been a good journey through. I really wanted, through your ideas, because I really wanted, this interview to be an opportunity actually to, I think, bring some of your work forward to younger integralists who aren't aware of what you are doing or your influence, I think, in part of Ken's work.
Thank you.
And your own contribution. So, yeah, I'm really glad for that.
Thank you so much. I look forward to when we have this on tape or recorded, and I would like to share the podcast or whatever you make with some of my own students as well.
Great. Yeah, we'll definitely make it available to you later this month.
In fact, you and I should keep in touch because I'm doing this stuff at CIS, and as you know, I'm recently the president of the Society for Consciousness Studies, and it's really an international organization. So let's keep in touch. Have a friendship here. And I'm going to go up and see Layman and take a warm sweater, and it'll be great. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right.
Take care and be safe.